Welcome.
Hi, Leeroy.
How are you doing today?
Good, good. Like I said, when we signed on, you can't beat Wellington on a good day. You can actually see a bit of the blue sky behind me. So,
Nice to hear about New Zealand having good weather. And you're right, you can't beat New Zealand on a great day.
yeah.
On most days, should I say. So just for the audience, do you want to just tell people a little bit about your bio if you were going to present at a conference and they asked you about a bio, what would you write down?
I would say that I'm currently medical director at Te Omanga Hospice in Lower Hutt in New Zealand. I am Canadian originally, and of course everybody can tell that from my accent. Came to New Zealand in 2003, had been in general practice for 10 years in a city called Guelph, Ontario, just outside of Toronto. Moved here with my family in 2003, did the Palliative Medicine Specialist training here in Wellington. Been at Te Omanga Hospice since 2008, medical director since 2012. So that's the conference bio part of my life. That's
great. And then I should also say that if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be a palliative medicine specialist because, as you and I know, the training was jumping through a lot of hoops, and you jumped through the hoop first, and luckily I was able to follow afterwards. So I'm forever indebted to you from that respect in terms of my professional career.
Well, thank you. And I want to share the love because without going into all of the agonizing story about how you and I, from general practice backgrounds, got into palliative medicine training in New Zealand. I did have to go to Australia, and I worked and actually turned Sal's ear into a beautiful silk purse. Had a wonderful time in Australia. I absolutely loved Australia. But came back to New Zealand, and then you called me up to say that you managed to avoid having to go through. And I was really, really grateful that you actually, called me up and let me know your story was going to be different than my story. I felt that was a really strong thing. And I remember being at an ANSPAM conference in Adelaide many years later. I hadn't seen you in a wee while. And you and I you were chatting with one of our Australian colleagues, younger than us. And I came up to you, and we had this very fond reunion. And this guy looked at us and he said, "I feel a whole lot of love going on." Yeah, that's about right. Yeah, I'd say that's right. That's right. Anyway, it was, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there's been many who've said there's a bit of a bromance going on. But anyway, let's just wash over that a little bit. So, general practice. What was the passion to get into general practice? How did you get into that?
That just was the fit with what I was attracted to within medical school. One of the aspects that I really, really liked was pediatrics. So in medical school and in the PGY 1 and 2 years and electives and so on, I did heaps and heaps and heaps of extra pediatrics to sort of fortify or strengthen what I was going to be taking into general practice. Did the general practice training, took over general practice of a guy who was himself 72, and the kind of bell curve of ages of a practice ages with the practitioner. So although I had lots of pediatrics, I also had a lot of geriatrics in this practice that I took over. So I found myself in the Canadian context doing all the CPD and continuing education stuff to sort of strengthen my skills in palliative medicine. And just finding I really, it was a privilege to do. I felt I was really making a huge difference for, the patients within my general practice who I was diagnosing with cancer and being with them on their palliative care journey. And I had, you want stories. I had a story that was sort of formative from a general practice point of view. This was literally, and I'm not kidding, it was the third day of being in the practice that I had just taken over. And a young 52-year-old university professor in the city I lived in came to say, my wife says, my skin is turning yellow. And I said, do you have any pain? And he said, no, I don't have any pain. And I instantly knew that this was cancer of the pancreas, presenting quite the communication skills challenge. I actually looked around for a mirror to see if this was an OSCE or something, because I mean I was that fresh out of training. It wasn't. So being with that patient and his family through all of the stages of, investigations that have to happen, the referral to surgery and his surgery. And he lived about 4 years. We did very well. And I was at his bedside, at his home, when he died 4 years later in the middle of the night. So it was that absolutely ideal general practice story from diagnosis to dying at home. That's really satisfying when you're in primary care. That's yeah.
And that's that continuity of care as well as whole person care that is sort of synonymous with general practice, but you could also argue it should be synonymous with the whole of healthcare, really. I mean, that approach. Yeah.
Oh,
and had you always...
Sorry, his wife was my patient. His 15-year-old son was my patient. The whole final approach to care, although I didn't have that word then.
And had you always wanted to be a doctor?
No, actually. I have a bit of time doing very, very basic science research before going to medical school. I was, this was cutting edge technology at the time, but I was making transgenic mice, infecting them with modified retrovirus vectors. And very, very far removed from what I do now.
So what happened to make the switch to do medicine?
Interesting. One of the colleagues in the lab who was just finishing her PhD, she came to work one day. She said, I was in the shower this morning and I was thinking about this experiment, that experiment, and the other experiment. And I thought to myself, I actually don't think about experiments at times like that. I thought I could really see that her success as a scientist was really a function of how it really was in her head all of the time. And it wasn't for me. It was not for me. So, I learned lots and it was interesting and so on, but that human connection, that using the skills, that patient care skills, that was absent. So it was that really, if you want a story that sort of shifted my direction, that comes as close as anything to shifting.
And were your parents medical at all?
Yeah, my father was a doctor. Well, and my grandfather was a doctor. So multi-generations. We all went to the same medical school, can you imagine?
Oh, right.
But my father was obstetrics and gynecology. So the family joke was, of course, he was at the beginning and I was at the end.
Yeah, yeah.
And then this you've primed me to think of stories. So I'm going to frame everything in terms of story, right? So you've prompted me to think of another story. When I first started at Te Omanga Hospice, where I am now, there were 3 nurses who had been midwives earlier in their career. And one of the strengths of the discipline is that diversity, that the clinicians who are in it come from a huge variety of backgrounds and everybody brings their own sort of skill set and experience. So 3 nurses who had been midwives in a previous phase of their career. And I thought, actually, that's not dissimilar. I wasn't an obstetrician, but, it was part of my upbringing and whatever. One of those midwives had a fabulous story connecting her experiences of midwife and her experience as a palliative care nurse. She described a delivery at home, perfectly normal, no dramas, very relaxed, insofar as deliveries could be relaxed. But from her point of view as the midwife, there was nothing alarming or nothing that she needed to, that was getting her anxious. She said, baby was born, everything was fine, and there was just a nanosecond where the baby didn't breathe. That was the first little hint in her clinical eye that was like, oh, okay, what's going on here? And she said, and at that very nanosecond, the baby breathed. And she felt distinctly like she saw or felt the soul enter that child. And, in many languages, the word breath is the same as the word for soul. So she felt she absolutely experienced that or saw that happening, in that instant. And again, it was there were no dramas. There was, and then the baby was fine and breathing normally and so on. And then, many, many years later, working in palliative medicine or palliative care, she felt that witnessing the final breath out, had exact parallel to what she had experienced as a midwife. So anyway, I thought there's an interesting sort of story for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's it's often said that doctors are not necessarily there at the actual moment of death, and it's usually the family. I know Sinead Donnelly did some great work in Ireland, just highlighting the experience of the families at the bedside when the actual moment happened. And often, there may be more likely the nurses will be there rather than doctors. But that kind of work that Sinead did was great in highlighting that aspect of end of life.
It's one of the things that when we have house surgeons and junior doctors at Te Omanga, and I recommend this to our training interns as well, I ask if they've ever been at the bedside of somebody dying, and most have not. And those who had, some have said, well, my grandfather or my grandmother. So that's all very useful experience. But as a doctor, it's very helpful to actually be at the bedside when somebody goes from breathing to not breathing. And I say there's clinical reasons why, like you see those changes. You might hear death rattle. You see the changes in circulation. There's a whole bunch of things that you need to be able to recognize later on in your career. But I say most important, it changes something inside you as a person to see somebody go from being alive to being dead. And that's very, very valuable when you're in a palliative care context and the death is expected. So there's no dramas. It allows you to sort of focus on all of those things, those physical changes in the person, but also the changes in you. Because the next time you see it when you're out of the hospice and you're back in your ED or wherever, and it's not an expected death and so on, you're a little bit more used to it or ready or not so shocked if you've seen somebody die before. I relate, speaking of stories, and the current generation of junior doctors are many of them have been fans and raised on Harry Potter. And I say about Harry Potter, I say to these junior doctors that I've just advised that they find an opportunity to be at the bedside when somebody dies. I say, do you remember in Harry Potter the concept of the Thestral, which is the mythical beast that is only visible to people who have seen somebody die? So Harry can, and some of the other characters can see, and to everybody else, they're invisible. So the Thestrals are these skeletal sort of horses that are winged, and they pull the carriages at Hogwarts. And most of the children can't see these things, but there's a handful who can because they have witnessed death. And I say, J.K. Rowling's onto something there. She's created in her magical world building a psychological reality that when you have seen somebody go from being alive to being dead, you are changed and you see things differently. I think, that's very inventive. And when I say that, most of the Harry Potter reading junior doctors are, oh yeah, they get it. They get
Yeah. And I think it's also underestimated how much people need to have a chat after they've been through that experience.
Yes. 100%.
I think that often that happens, and when they're supported well, they'll come and talk to you and say, and they're often a little bit shaken because it's the first death they've seen.
Yes.
And actually been there, and that enables us to then have a bit of a chat about that and then prepare them hopefully for what they're going to see more in their clinical experience. It's not only doctors, it's nurses as well, and other disciplines as well. Yeah.
Before a junior doctor comes to our service, we send an orientation pack, whatever stuff, to them, including a PowerPoint presentation put together by our counselor and director of family support at our hospice that she has done for all staff and volunteers, that during their orientation, she walks through this PowerPoint presentation on exactly the theme of this work has impact on you.
Yeah.
you start from the presumption that this work will have impact. And then how are you going to recognize the impact? Some people, over-identify, some people detach. I mean, where are you going to be in this work? And then how do you maintain the correct sort of balance with this work, acknowledging that this work has impact? So I send it to all of the junior doctors before they come. And as part of their orientation, I actually call up and I speak to that PowerPoint. And it does cover off that need to debrief about these things and what are the options, And it's interesting how I've had 2 junior doctors, and I hope, because I sent that PowerPoint and spoke to it at their orientation, they felt able to come to me. One of them, she came a couple of weeks into the run, and she said, I took a run in palliative medicine because I wanted to learn about symptom control and communication skills, and I knew that everybody dies when they come under hospice care, blah, blah. And then she paused and she said, but everybody dies. So that sort of head reality of everybody dying, that was all right. But she was experiencing the reality of everybody dies. So we were able to link her with, some professional support, during that time, and it all ended well. We had another junior doctor who came who was very disturbed because, again, she had come, she knew it was palliative medicine, she knew she wanted to learn all of these things, and all sorts of stuff about her previous experience with deaths in her family and so on was really overwhelming her. So the support we provided to her was a much higher sort of level. But again, thank goodness she was able to come and say, look, I'm really struggling. Sort of, I knew all of these things were there, but the reality of being here is, I need some help. So,
and I think that's one of the things I miss from over here in Australia. So when I was in New Zealand, we would have monthly supervision, clinical supervision that was provided by the organisation, by the hospice.
Is that not a paid benefit for you in your current role?
It's not. Well, we can seek it out and pay for it ourselves, but it's not paid for by the organisations that we work for. But that opportunity to reflect on cases is, very important from anyone's work. The other thing I kind of reflected on just in conversation, obviously from a Canadian perspective, Australia and New Zealand, there's an Indigenous population that we have to bear in mind. And I've always reflected on, we have a lot to learn from other cultures and how they deal with death and dying. Rather than the kind of Western approach that we sort of say, well, this is how we do things in the healthcare system. How have you found the differences between the Indigenous populations that you've seen? Because you did work a little bit in Australia, you probably didn't see very much from that perspective.
Very little. I was in Foster near Wilson's Promontory National Park. I think I may have seen one Aboriginal patient the entire time.
And that's pretty good because you're only over for a short period of time at that point. But in terms of New Zealand and Canada, have you got any reflections on that?
The Maori way of death and dying, one of the most striking things when I was fresh off the boat was a body being at home after death. I never saw that once in Canada, never once. So to come here and learn that that's actually common. I think the regulations are different in Australia, but it's very common here. So a number of times I had to view a body after death at a patient's home. So sometimes they'll have been to the funeral home and then embalmed and return to the patient's home. And just to sort of witness that presence of the deceased with the family, the children, everybody, the extended family, the tent built off the back of the house to accommodate the crowds of people, that whole thing, really, really eye-opening. And I thought, how fantastic is this? Like, it's sort of, in the New Zealand context, I think it also slightly overlaps with the Irish wake thing, where it's not strictly a Indigenous Māori thing, but those two things maybe have come together to make it a very common a common thing. And I thought, how healthy is that? That this is not shoved away in a hospital. This is visible. So that's after death. And then, of course, the emphasis within the discipline of palliative care, permitting death at home, but it also being a cultural priority. Not, 100%, but, you have to ask always, but for death to happen at home. So a couple of times I've had a Maori patient in the inpatient unit who wanted to be at home to die, and I've organized things so that they're put in an ambulance and they've died in the ambulance on the way home. And rather than that being seen as a, oh my God, failure, both times it was like, great, on their way home. That was cool. That was all part of it. That was an acceptable sort of thing. Both times, I want to say the ambulance crew well briefed, and they knew how to participate in the blessing of the ambulance and, all of that sort of thing. It was extremely well handled by the ambulance colleagues. So all parts of, the service were like understanding that was a priority. So that's I have another really interesting story sort of at the sort of front end of hospice and its connection with a Maori patient. We had a referral to see an elderly Maori gent. And I went with one of the advanced trainees in palliative medicine. So I was there not to do the initial assessment, but I was there to do a, mini CEX for her. And so we arrive, myself, the registrar, and one of the hospice nurses. We typically do a doctor plus nurse initial assessment at the home. He was there with one other family member, and complicated medical history. I won't reveal, but I can't even remember the medical complication. But what was striking was what he wanted to talk about was his history and his family and where he had come from. And he wanted to talk about his name, his surname, and the connection with the stars of Matariki. Like the whole thing that he was doing at an initial meeting was establishing who he was for us. It was his story, personal, but his, family story, his mythic story. It was just a really striking example of, stepping into his place, his world, and just having to go with his direction. So all of the sort of complicated, we kind of got the basics of the medical stuff. And then it was another visit where the rest of it all had to happen. But it was absolutely wonderful, actually. Absolutely.
And that sort of, I was going to say that fits in with the idea of walking into someone's home. So that great aspect of community care, going to see someone in their own home. You either take off your shoes, you don't, you put them outside or whatever, you have respect for their world and their space. And, many a time I agree that the person has told you as the practitioner, this is what is going to happen because of their view of how things are. And often when they come into hospital or in their clinic, there's not that level of respect that's shown. The kind of, it's almost like they maybe don't feel that they can express themselves. Although, however, I must say, Maori people and their whānau will certainly make sure that they express that to you as a clinician. And I think that's just the way it should be. I certainly, my story for when I moved to New Zealand from the UK, when I first met a Maori person, I'd heard all the things that we should and shouldn't do, and was really getting to grips with all that. And I said to the person, I'm just new, and I'll be guided by if I'm doing something wrong, you tell me. And the woman said to me, that's fine. If you do it wrong, I'll tell you. And if you do it wrong again, I'll tell you again. If you do it wrong a third time, you won't be invited back. And I think that, that kind of summed up my experience with how I started to, try to understand as much as possible and recognize that we will make mistakes. We will make errors that will need correction, and we need to just learn from that. And that was a great way to learn from any patient who sort of tells you a little bit about their lives and how you can move forward with that.
Another story about how I learned when I was fresh off the boat. This was my introduction to how decision-making works in the context of the whānau. And so the patient, again, elderly woman, I was working at Mary Potter Hospice. The hospice nurse and I were doing the initial assessment. The hospice nurse was herself Maori, which was extremely helpful. But I arrived at the home of this elderly woman who, and I was made aware very, like at the beginning, that my role was not to decide whether or not this person could go to Ruatoria, but how was I going to help this person get to Ruatoria? That became very clear. Could she get on a plane? Oh, no, absolutely not. There was no way that she could get on the plane. So, I did my piece. I saw the patient. I talked with her. I went back out, and this was my introduction to the aunties, the concept of the aunties, because she was the eldest of probably 8, and there were 6 aunties and a few uncles. And it was the discussion about how was this going to happen. And during the time we were there, a van appears with no seats in it and a mattress in the back. And the plan was a syringe driver so that she would be comfortable. This was long enough ago that a great stack of paper that outlined her story went with her, and a phone number, should she get into strife, stop anywhere at some hospital and phone the hospice and can give advice. One of the aunties says, if she dies on the way, well, if she dies on the way, keep going, and communicating with the team at the other end, the receiving team at the other end. And as I watched this elderly dying woman with a syringe driver in the back of the van drive off, I thought to myself, goodness, you're not in Canada anymore. And I turned to the nurse and I said, where's Ruatoria? I had no idea, no clue, not realizing it was probably a 11-hour drive. And I'm like, right, what have I just done? Anyway, I thought it was a wee while away, not that far somehow. I don't know, I had no idea. But that was the we talk about it in palliative care as the sort of unit of care as the family. Well, that was the decision-making unit as well in that setting.
And I know you went to India for a period of time and explored a little bit of Ayurvedic medicine.
For myself, yes.
Yeah. So
self-care.
Self-care. So how did you get into that? How did you explore that area?
That's one of my nurse colleagues at Te Omanga Hospice, Kiwi nurse, who's gone back and forth, well, for decades actually, much of the time to Trivandrum, working with Dr. Rajgopal, who many people will recognize the name, and his palliative care clinic in Trivandrum. A point came where she returned from Kerala with Kerala husband, who is an Ayurvedic therapist. So I started to see him for my own aches and body pains. And then she and her husband organized these trips to Kerala for 2 weeks of daily Ayurvedic therapy. So I went 3 times for that. So that was personal. But we did connect with, because most of us were from the hospice, we did connect with Dr. Rajgopal, met him, and I went out one day with their community team, and just eye-opening experience to see the fabulous work that they do with a smell of an oily rag. Incredible work that they do.
Life-changing experience, I'd imagine.
Also very high standard, very high reliance on volunteers. And it's a different sort of patient population. We saw a number of people who are tetraplegic, from falling out of coconut trees. The natural history of untreated tetraplegia is death. And there's no sort of rehab, like there's no stream that takes these people who have no money and no health insurance. So they do come to sort of palliative care and often live a long time because they're getting the care.
Yeah.
They wouldn't meet they wouldn't meet our criteria. But there's an alternative. You know?
Yeah. And another thing I know that you've used to help with reflections and the work that we do is music.
Yeah, that's.
And I know that was your project, wasn't it? From training, was it?
My project was a spin-off of that. My project was, how do doctors learn about spirituality? And it was a literature review, and it was perfect for a project because, of course, the literature on how do doctors learn about spirituality is very small. The literature on healthcare and spirituality is humongous, but mine was a very narrow. So it was a different kind of literature review because it encompassed every kind of article. But it was a spin-off, a sort of more fun spin-off was the concert that I organized in 2010. Looking at Black American music and what it tells us about grief, loss, and healing, most importantly, healing. Yeah. And the story around the genesis of that is I had gone to see a fabulous documentary. You can put it in the show notes, Standing in the Shadows of Motown, which was came out in the 1990-something, which interviews the men who were the backup band for Motown. So they were called the Funk Brothers, and they were the people who played behind, Diana Ross and Marvin Gaye and Martha Reeves and all other people. So it was always the same. And it was just about them because they didn't get the credit or the fame or whatever. It's their story. So it talked to them now as men in their 60s and 70s, footage of the time. The final scene of the film, there's a radio DJ who's in that, because they convened for a concert. So it's in an arena in Detroit or a concert venue in Detroit. And the announcer says, drum section, Uriel Jones, Pistol Allen, and the late Benny Benjamin. And the two guys who are alive come out and they bring a big photo of the guy who has died. And they put it on a music stand. And then the announcer says, guitar section, so-and-so and so-and-so, and the late so-and-so. And the same thing. The guys who are alive come with a picture of the guy who has died. And by the time they start to play, the band is all reunited, the guys who are still alive and the guys who have died. And the song that they performing is Ain't No Mountain High Enough, right? Which is, I remember the day you set me free, you can always count on me. It's sort of a breakup song between a man and a woman, Marvin Gaye, Tammy Terrell. Yeah. But it works as a song of connection, the continuing bonds that we all know about from, studies in grief and loss. That sort of, you just reframe the way you continue your relationship with the person who's died. So a beautiful sort of musical, sort of heartfelt telling of that sort of way of keeping connection with people who've died. So I seen that film, saw that final scene and thought, gosh, and then started to reflect on all kinds of Black American music has exactly that same sort of message if you listen for it. So I put together, for my own purposes, what I call the Palliative Care Rhythm and Blues Songbook. So it's a sort of 2 CD length composition with all kinds of gospel, Motown, jazz, blues, hip hop, all exploring that theme of grief, loss, and healing. And there was a workshop in Hobart where Palliative care doctors were invited to. It was on the theme of exploring hope and meaning. And I thought, oh, this is great. It's a small workshop, not very many guests or participants, no speakers. So we were all encouraged to bring something to contribute to this theme of exploring hope and meaning. So I brought that sort of work that I had been doing, played a few tracks, and sort of we talked about things. That's the genesis of the concert, and then I got invited to give a version of that talk to another conference. That was fun. Then I was invited to speak to Brian Crump, Radio New Zealand, for Hospice Appeal Week. So it was the fundraising thing. They needed somebody to present and talk about palliative care. Now, we didn't talk about my music project on air, but he'd seen my CV and it had this talk that I had given. So he asked about it. He's very musical himself. So we had this conversation, and he said to me, have you ever thought of doing it as a live concert? And I was like, that would be a dream. And I'm a palliative care doctor, not a concert promoter. Well, I became a concert promoter, and I learned steep learning curve. But it was truly one of the most fabulous things I've ever achieved in my life, because it took a year. Brian connected me with a young journalist who was a muso in Wellington and knew all the musicians on the scene. I knew the minute Elisa Tomlins said yes, I knew the music would be fabulous, and all the other musical people in Wellington signed up. I circulated my song selection. They each chose like a sort of musical chairs.
Yeah.
There was no conflict. Everybody had their own idea of what they wanted. They all chose a different thing. Anyway, my job as promoter was to get the money to put this all on and approach sponsors and get this sort of. So we did it not as a fundraiser. We did it as a sort of promotion thing. So we had a $30 ticket price. So that was a cheap ticket price. And I knew if it was like a $200 ticket price, it would be all the sort of gray-haired people like me who support hospice. So $30 ticket price, we had a much wider and much younger audience.
Yeah.
Absolutely fabulous. A lot of the musicians, Maori Pacifica, because who in New Zealand does Black American music? Who does gospel, jazz, Motown, reggae, blah, blah.
Yeah.
A lot of Maori Pacifica. So that was a lot of, the performers on, and they were all exemplary musically, like absolutely exemplary. Some musicians took a song and turned it into their own. Some did more straightforward covers. That was fine, whatever way. It was exciting to me to hear sort of new interpretations of the same song. So yeah, it was sort of one of the highlights of my life. And it's real interesting. Just a couple of weeks ago, one of the casual nurses at the hospice said that her nephew was visiting her, and she were remembering that concert. And she came to me and she said, my nephew was just saying, and he's a guy who's now like 30. That was one of the best concerts he's ever gone to in his life. And I thought, oh, that's high praise. I was really chuffed.
Yeah.
Still getting the positive feedback about that. Because the sort of, you think music about grief, loss, and healing. Well, the energy of the whole thing was on a massive increased trajectory. So everybody left happy and high and excited. And, it wasn't a gloom and doom at all. It had an amazing effect. So, yeah.
And has it continued as a fundraising activity, or was it one-off?
It was a one-off. It was, I must say,
you didn't want to be a concert.
My day job, let's say that. I mean, it was. I have toyed with doing it again, and what I would do, the version I would do, concert number 2, would be to go to the musicians and say, "This is the theme, death, grief, loss, healing. Bring me your songs on that theme, and let's put together a concert with your own music on that theme." And that would be, I think, really, really exciting. So anyway.
Well, maybe if anyone's watching this, maybe between Australia and New Zealand, we could combine resources and put something together like that. That might be something to look forward to at one of the conferences or something, or just something that's put on. You mentioned volunteers.
Yes.
Earlier on, and I'm sure that many volunteers were involved in trying to support that concert as well as many other activities within hospice. And certainly, I think that, like I've heard you say before, so a lot of the hospice work would not have occurred without the support of volunteers who do so much for us. I heard you mention in a podcast about porphyry that's done for people coming to work at Te Omanga as volunteers, and they sort of each stand up and say what their story is about why they want to volunteer. That's quite a powerful thing, and obviously maybe you'd want to explain to people what porphyry is, but also what stories you've heard that have moved the staff in the hospice in terms of respecting the volunteers coming to them coming to work with us.
Yeah. The Pufri it's for all new staff and volunteers. We run it 4 times a year. The structure is, that the current staff who are on site are inside to welcome the new staff and volunteers who are called, called in from the outside into the building. And then, karakia sort of prayer. So the formal welcome part happens, and then our staff go back to work. But the volunteers that part of the orientation is presentations by, me or one of the medical team, our chief executive, talking a little bit about the hospice. But it's more a welcome thing. But one of the main events is there's a Paunamu piece of greenstone, which is passed volunteer staff, volunteer, all the way around, and everybody stands up and says what their experience is. And what we know is that many volunteers have an experience of bereavement and return to bring that experience to help others in other ways. And I just love the diversity of roles that the volunteers have. I mean, from working in the garden to make sure the place is beautiful, to volunteering in the shops, to sitting with patients, and then the biography service. And people have that need to give back, that desire to give back, and I guess they just sort of match their own sort of skills with what they feel they can do for the hospice. I'm always struck by, in the shops, the volunteers in the shops are receiving the items from somebody who's bereaved, often, not always, of course, but often, that person who's dropping off their deceased husband's clothes. And there's an emotional impact of doing that, letting go of these things. So as a volunteer in the hospice shops, you have to sort of be sensitive to that and acknowledge that in some sort of a way.
Yeah.
The other really important therapeutic thing that our volunteers do is, of course, the biography service, which connects absolutely with the theme of this podcast, which is getting the stories, getting a person's stories. And when I suggest, and you probably had the same experience, when I suggest to a patient, many of our patients, do biography, my life has been boring, or I haven't done anything in my life. They go through the process, they get the biography, they see it, they read it, and they're like amazed and happy and thrilled. And it's really, honestly, it's more therapeutic than anything I do. I mean, my job is to sort of make sure they don't have pain, nausea, vomiting, constipation, and other sort of symptoms, for them to get on with the real work, which is telling their story and getting their story down.
Yeah. But there's an aspect of whole person care where we hopefully create the space with a team, sometimes individually, for that magic to happen, because everyone's got a story. And, part of this whole process of this podcast is to share some of those stories. And I'll put the appeal out at the moment. If there's anyone who wants to share a story of their experience, I'm more than happy to, make that happen through this medium. And I think that we're telling stories about people indirectly, but to hear from people about their own stories and has a huge impact, I think, in how we can deliver care, but also from a societal perspective. I mean, the way that you brought those musicians from a Maori background into a hospice event connects that community to the hospice. It connects Maori to that community as well. It's a great way of, music being the connection that keeps us going.
To bring this right back to my observation, my experience of Maori when the deceased is lying at home and the mourners are around the coffin on the floor, the mourners are on the floor themselves with their legs tucked sort of underneath them. At the concert, A Change Is Going to Come, Sam Cooke, A Change Is Going to Come, was performed by Rhea Hall. And on the night, she came out on stage in a beautiful black, dress, barefoot. she had a microphone. She came to the front of the stage and she sort of sat on the floor, with one arm down and the microphone with her legs tucked, exactly like the mourners at a tangi.
Yeah.
And, she sang the lyrics, I was born by the river in a little tent, just like the river in running sense, da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
And then the point where in the sort of bridge part of the song, the lyric is something about, I go to the movies, I go to, my brother keeps knocking me on my knees.
Yeah.
She stood up. And it was like, I get chills thinking about how she went from that position of somebody, mourning to sort of standing up, that sort of transition that Sam Cooke has in the song from being afraid of change to accepting change, and then to looking forward to change. That's the brilliant transition in this song. She sort of symbolized that by standing up, and it's like, oof, like fabulous. But it was, I recognized the sort of Maori context and spin or whatever, or I don't know, that's not the right word, but the sort of
the Maori take on it.
She did that interpretation of the Sam Cooke classic.
Yeah.
You can find that on YouTube. We'll put it in the show notes.
I have to put a link in. Yeah. Currently, with your work, and I know that there's been many changes in Australia and New Zealand in terms of palliative care. So what's the message that Te Omanga's trying to get out in terms of palliative care to the community? Same as before, or has it changed at all?
There's a couple of messages that sort of message that we're not just at the end of life, but we're, involved throughout the whole course of a terminal illness is one. That's still, what is palliative care? Still, after all of these years and deep community engagement, that needs to be refreshed all the time, in all sorts of different and more creative sort of ways. And that's one message. One message which I find very hard to convey, and it was one of the things that motivated me behind the concert, was that message that with the terminal illness, there's still meaning making and joy that can sort of happen in that time between the diagnosis and of a terminal illness and death. That's an extremely hard message to convey.
Yeah.
People outside of the business or people who've not experienced it, it sounds like a very Pollyanna sort of things like, yeah, right. People won't sort of believe it. But I mean, it's been my personal experience, but it's also been something that I've witnessed over and over again. And it's something that I feel that's one of the main things that we do. Like I said, I'm there to make sure they're not in pain and nausea and vomiting. And we have a family support team to help them with art, music therapy, counseling, whatever it takes, spiritual care, biography, whatever it takes to bring that out. That's an extremely difficult message to get across.
Yeah.
And then in the context of New Zealand and the assisted dying legislation, the message that we are there regardless of patients' own choice about assisted dying. We're there to do the palliative care. It's all about the living. Whether it's natural death or assisted death, that doesn't matter. We're still there doing the same support all the way along with no judgment. Yeah. So, there's your 3-point sermon right there.
Yeah. And do you feel that you're seeing more people early on in terms of their illness, that kind of early referral, is that sort of improved in your time?
Yes, and the nature of, and this is sort of a subject of a whole other, almost more technical podcast, but the changing nature of the patient population in palliative care, the aging of death, how, and Heather McLeod's excellent data in New Zealand on, the huge numbers of death, absolute numbers of people who will die in the next 30 years in New Zealand, and the fact that they are older and they come to us with their chronic illnesses, and we have to manage all of those chronic illnesses, plus that many cancers with all these immunological agents are becoming more like chronic illnesses. So that sort of notion of episodic care is sort of increasing. We our response has been a couple of things. We asked GPs, what more do you need from hospice? They said, we need access to your family support, the counseling and therapies, because that's something that is very difficult to access in primary care. So we created a whole way that a GP can actually refer, or primary care team can actually refer for just the psychosocial only, because it could be early in the trajectory of an illness and patient doesn't need medical nursing, OT, blah, 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 but they're devastated by this diagnosis, and so are the children. So what they really need is the input from our specialist counselors and our music therapists. And that might happen, and then it could be a couple of years before somebody comes back needing all the other components of sort of hospice care. So that's been sort of one response. And just really reflecting on other ways that we can support other teams, primary care teams, secondary care teams, to sort of care for patients, with the specialist input that we provide. So a lot of creative thinking about how do we address that desire to have early intervention sort of appropriately with the right people. And equity is a massive sort of consideration. How do we do that in an equitable sort of a way across all the kinds of inequity that there are, the many, many kinds of inequity that there are? How do we address and deliver our care across those groups?
And do you think in healthcare that we're seeing more holistic care being provided across the board? I mean, I think that, so I was talking to a group of people recently and mentioned the approach that palliative care has from a holistic direction. And they were saying, it's a pity that you have to be at the end of life to receive that. And I kind of said, no, that's what we should all be doing in healthcare.
Correct.
And I kind of sometimes reflect whether we're making any difference in that holistic approach being adopted, because we're all kind of taught in an undergraduate courses about whole person care and attending to all those different domains. But do we really see it in practice? And is it because of the system, or is it because we just focused on the physical too much? Do you think we've made any difference with that from what you've seen?
There are huge systemic, barriers to all teams doing that sort of holistic care. Again, subject of another really in-depth podcast question, but I think the barriers are more systemic, because I think clinicians want to deliver that sort of care, whether you're a nurse in aged care or a GP in primary care or an oncologist. I believe people all want to deliver that sort of holistic care, and there are just constraints across, their ability to sort of do that. One thing one way that we preach our sermon, the one way that we empower is by, we have our patch, we have junior doctors, right? So we have training interns, we have surgeons, we have registrars. And one thing that gives me great satisfaction is when I get the sort of feedback that one of those junior doctors who's gone on to another role, there's evidence that they've changed their approach. So we have a house surgeon, we have an aged residential care team of nurse specialists who go into all the nursing homes to deliver palliative care, and they get referrals from hospitals. So the team leader of our aged residential care team came with a funny story. She said she was reading this referral from a house surgeon, and she thought, my, this is an extremely good referral. And then she flipped over to the back and saw the name was the last house surgeon who had been at Te Omanga Hospice. So she had gone to her new role in geriatrics, and then our team leader said it happened like a week later. She was reading another one thinking, this is an excellent referral, and it was the same. So it was a sustained change in the practice of that particular house surgeon. I hope it has survived for a long time. We recently had a registrar for 6 months who comes from the rural hospital medicine training scheme here. So he'd been doing peds and OB in Rotorua, and then he was off at the Dunstan Hospital, and then he came back to Te Omanga Hospice for 6 months, and now he's back at the Queenstown Hospital doing emergency. So that's, his career path is going to be in small rural areas. Well, inequity, access to good palliative care. How good is it that he's come and done 6 months with us? Sent me a text message the other day. Just saw a 43-year-old, who was hoping to get back to Australia. Cancer was far too advanced. So, I set this person up with a syringe driver and a great view down the lake at Queenstown.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, like mission accomplished, He had the medical skills to put up the syringe driver, and he was thinking, okay, this guy's not going to get back to Oz. So set him up with a beautiful view down the lake. I thought, that warmed my heart, that we were able to have, that rural hospital medicine trainee is going to be doing that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
For their career. It's like, that's really wonderful.
And I think throughout this conversation, Ian, there's a reflection on the ripple effect. You never know how far those ripples are going to extend, but we hope the ripple effect will make people think differently about how they look after people, and also how we're affected by the ripples of the patients and families that we see, and other clinicians we meet along the way. So I just in kind of reflection on that holistic care question I posed, one of the things I kind of thought about a few years ago was the fact that hospitals are really designed for physical care, and that we shouldn't be beating ourselves up too much about the provision of holistic care within a hospital setting, because actually the psychological support, the spiritual support, the social support comes from the community. And so it's about our communities supporting each other, and the work that we do from a palliative care perspective, where we do go wherever the setting is that the patient's in, is that important part of what we do across settings, but also in the community. It has a huge impact of how we can support people and bring communities together. And that compassionate communities kind of approach, is another element of that, which is another podcast as well. But I know that you guys are very much involved with that as well from New Zealand's perspective into compassionate communities. So that was kind of my take on that kind of argument. Sometimes we beat ourselves up to try and provide all the holistic care in the hospital, and it's not possible really when you think about it. We haven't got the time. We haven't seen people from that continuity of care perspective. And it's about empowering the communities to support each other. I think that's done beautifully with Maori and their whānau in New Zealand.
And as a person who's in this business professionally, I also have learned that the importance of saying yes whenever I get asked about my role from organizations outside of my role. And I'm building up to talk about my my connection with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which we were talking to before you started to record this podcast. But, at the ripe old age of 58, 5 years ago, I decided to take up martial art for the first time ever. Mad. But also really fabulous. It's great fitness. It's great sort of integrating your brain and your mind. It's also, how do you be in the present moment? We all aspire to be in the present moment. When you have your partner coming at you to, crush you or submit your arm or choke you, it's like, you're in the present moment. But the guy who runs the club that I belong to asked me to participate in his series on wellness. So he was getting many of the guys who are in the club and women in the club to talk about their area of expertise in the context of wellness. Because it's quite a diverse group who do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So, he asked me, he said, "You're a doctor, what can you talk about?" I said, "Well, I'm a palliative care doctor." So his challenge to me my challenge was to do a talk on wellness or well-being and death. So it was really to a lay audience. So it was a really interesting thing to sort of pull together to sort of talk about. And I am going to stray now into sort of a personal story. When my wife died about 2 years ago, and I was away from New Zealand, we went back to Canada to be with her sister and so on. And then I came back, and I would go back to the gym to sort of do my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But I must say my brain was not entirely engaged. I mean, I was going because in bereavement, it's really good to take physical care of yourself. And, being in the present moment with these guys was really an important thing. I hadn't told many of them that this was happening in my life. I told the coach, and I told a couple of the guys who I know better. But there was one Friday, I go on Friday at midday. One Friday morning, I woke up feeling like shit here at home. It's sad
Yeah.
And I thought, I won't go to the gym. And then I thought, no, I've got to go into Wellington I had therapy, counseling appointment for myself later, and I'll go into my. So I went, I told myself, you'll feel better after, you go to the gym. So I went. We were doing throws from standing. So I'm with my partner, who's a lovely 6'4", 100 kg Brazilian guy. And I'm throwing him to the ground, and he's throwing me to the ground, and I'm throwing him to the ground, and he's throwing me to the ground. I don't like throws from standing. I mean, it's all part of what I do, but I prefer sort of being on the ground. At the end of the session, I could tell that he'd been throwing me to the ground, but he'd been taking some care, right? I'm as old as his grandfather, probably. So I turned to thank him for taking the care, and I just got really tearful. Like, I'd woken up feeling shitty, So I turned to him and he just, put his arm on my shoulder and said, "It's all right." Now, one of the guys who I had told what had happened was standing like 3 feet away, turned and he could see this was happening. And again, it was like, "I'm so sorry." Just hardly any words, but just a whole incredible supportive sort of network or feeling from these two guys. So I go to the change room, and I'm there by myself in the change room, and I'm like actually crying. Pull myself together. And the coach walks into the room. Now, he happens to be the same age as me. And he says, "Oh, you were looking pretty good during those throws." So, of course, I was burst into tears all over again because, anyway, he did know that my wife had died. So he was just like, "Look, I'm so sorry. If there's anything you need, just, call, we'll go for a talk, blah, blah, blah." I pulled myself together. So I got myself together. By the time I got to my counseling appointment, of course, I felt like $1 million. So that's the supportive community, to sort of bring it back to your point. This is just a bunch of people, some of whom knew, some of who didn't, but the whole ethos is just, what is going on for Ian is pretty lousy, we'll just be sort of supportive. You can't beat that. There's no substitute for that. And that whole thing needs to be everywhere. That needs to be everywhere.
Yeah. Well, Ian, look, thank you for sharing your personal stories, but also the stories that you've encountered along the way. You're a very special person, as I can testify, but hopefully a lot of people will see that through your sharing of your stories, and also the way that you've spoken about how we can connect and care for people around us. So I want to thank you for being part of this.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And enjoy the rest of your sunny day in Wellington.
Thank you. Very good.
All right.
Thanks,
Take care.
Fabulous idea.